And I also think that it's interesting that these agricultural land grabs were in the media, but it didn't really lead to large-scale mobilizations. On the contrary, the more recent plans to sacrifice agricultural land to lithium mining did bring out thousands in the streets.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Hello, you are listening to the Transformative Podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations. My name is Jelena Đureinović. In this episode, we discuss land and post-socialist transformations in Southeast Europe and the perspectives on studying this subject. My guest today is Dr. Katarina Kušić, who is a postdoc researcher and also my colleague at the University of Vienna. Her ongoing research project investigates the relations that make and remake the meaning of land in political, social, ecological, and economic transformations, looking at the levels of policymaking, everyday experiences, and also alternative political imaginaries in Southeast Europe. Katarina's book, entitled Beyond International Intervention, Politics of Improvement in Serbia, is coming out early next year with the University of Michigan Press. Hi, Katarina. Thank you for talking to me today.
Hi, Jelena. Thank you for having me.
The first obvious question that comes to my mind, of course, is why land and land relations?
Okay, so to answer this question, I have to go a little bit back, and that is actually to my PhD research project and the monograph that is coming out of it that you mentioned, I think in March 2025. This project was a bit more, let's say, orthodox international relations, my discipline, in that it investigated how everyday people experience international efforts of peace building, democracy promotion, and development. But in designing this research, I wanted to avoid some of the established tropes in international research on the Balkans. So I went to investigate two fields that are quite different, both from each other and from the topics usually researched in this field. And this is non-formal youth education and agricultural governance. And of course, I did this research in Serbia, as the title that you mentioned shows. Now, agricultural governance is a fascinating topic, but it's also really immensely complex. I think it's enough to say that the common agricultural policy in the EU regularly takes up half of the total annual budget, and the legislative changes related to food and agriculture that need to be completed in the EU accession process take up a really, really large portion of the acquis communautaire. While I was researching changes in agricultural governance in Serbia, the issue of agricultural land was hotly debated in both national media and among people involved in agricultural production and agricultural policy. And this was for two reasons. First of all, Serbia had signed the Stabilization and Association Agreement with a stipulation on opening its land markets in 2017. And this is very uncommon. Even new EU members usually implement moratoriums on the sale of agricultural land. And the second issue was the very contentious and various foreign investments that either happened or were expected to happen in agriculture, and specifically in agricultural land. And now in doing this research, it seemed peculiar to me that such an important topic, land, is nevertheless left out of EU's mandate in agricultural governance. So I wanted to look more closely in this issue of agricultural land. The monograph that's coming out makes a case for looking at land as an important theme for planning development in both economic and political terms. But during this research, it also became obvious that land is more than the object of policy, and I treated it as an object of policy. So yes, it is important in state-making projects and economic policy, but it's also more than that. It's a site of emotional attachment, kinship, identity, and more than human relations. So very, very shortly after completing that research, where land was only a small part of a larger project, I knew I wanted to do a different project that is better able to consider these many meanings of land. I think it's an exciting topic of research because of these many meanings that it can take on, and because these meanings are always negotiated to different political projects. You can think of things really, really varied, like Yugoslav agricultural reforms or current biodiversity conservation projects. They are both very important and have very different conceptions of what land is and how it should be used. But besides my interest in this meaning making that happens around land, I think it's also important to know that land is a key issue in most climate adaptation and mitigation policies. Now, you'll hear people like in the media and in research talk a lot about solar farms, about nature conservation, national parks, or, for example, organic food production. These are very different policies, but at the foundation of all of these policies is land. So its meanings and use will, I think, be even more contested and more fraught in the near future.
You are focusing on Southeast Europe. So, of course, here we have first socialist Yugoslav transformations in this context, and then post-socialist transformations when it comes to land. Can you explain how is land central to these processes of transformation?
Yes, sure. And I think maybe also before going into the specificities of socialist and post-socialist transformations, I should also say that as I progressed with my research during the last year, because this is now year 2 of my project officially, my focus also somewhat expanded. So now I don't think just about agricultural land, but also about land and landscapes more generally. And this came out from like different dynamics that I observed. So I think partially it is because I also started researching pastoralism and extensive grazing. And these are forms of agriculture that are not so place-bound to easily be quantified in hectares. Like there's no field that you can kind of say this is agriculture and this is the rest of my life. But I think it's also because I saw that land more generally is at stake in the current political moment, not just agricultural land. So with that in mind, I think there are many, many kind of very specific things about socialist and post-socialist transformations, but there are also many commonalities with other global trends. So if we talk about socialist development, Yugoslavia's history here is quite specific when it comes to agricultural land. Yugoslavia, along with Poland, is special in that it stopped collectivization efforts quite early. So its trajectory is very different from other socialist countries that completed this immense project of collectivization. There was a very different organization of agriculture, and therefore a different organization of land, and therefore also a different organization of peasant politics and rural politics. But what it had in common with other socialist countries is the modernizing project that looked to nature as well as the people as sites of improvement. So a lot of agricultural land was actually created during Yugoslavia through, for example, draining wetlands. Yugoslavia sought to increase surface area under production. Or another example that I'm currently reading a lot about is the improving of karst areas, the so-called passive areas in Yugoslavia. The authorities looked at these arid, rocky landscapes as a developmental problem and were really concerned on how to make these areas more productive and more producing. When we come to the post-socialist era, again, the lack of collectivization means a big difference. So there was no decollectivization of land, like in Romania, for example, but we still see some major changes in the governance of agricultural land. Elites took power of large agricultural companies and the land that these companies held. Now, this was something that was common across post-socialist countries, but in Yugoslavia, this was also shaped by the war and post-war transformations that allowed for, I think, even more corruption due to the kind of just larger disruption that happened during and after the war. And then, of course, different successor states within Yugoslavia dealt with this land differently. Croatia, for example, went with long-term concessions given to buyers in privatization processes. Serbia's trajectory was more complicated because it tried to first create a short-term lease market, and then since, I think, 2015, 2016, also to encourage large foreign investments. And in Serbia, it's the most controversial land deals that happen and that can be described as land grabs. Large holdings are sold to foreign investors under very opaque circumstances. For example, within the same agreement with the United Arab Emirates that brought about the very contested and infamous Belgrade waterfront redevelopment, there was also included a large deal in agricultural land in Vojvodina. A more recent example is the privatization of PKB, Poljoprivredni Kombinat Belgrade. And just this week, there was news that some of this agricultural land that was sold will have to be bought back in the process of building a new stadium and expo space, of course, for a lot more money. So from the perspective of political economy and the international positioning of Serbia, agricultural land is kind of always an exciting and an important topic. And I also think that it's interesting that these agricultural land grabs were in the media, especially while I was doing my fieldwork in 2016, 2017, but it didn't really lead to large-scale mobilizations. And this is a topic I always come back to. On the contrary, the more recent plans to sacrifice agricultural land to lithium mining did bring out thousands in the streets. So we are seeing now a strong wave of green mobilizations around the Balkans. And of course, these mobilizations are not often framed around land. They're about extractivism, about new forms of green imperialism. But I think it's also about land and about ways in which we imagine living with familiar landscapes in the future. So I think this new wave of extraction, whether this is lithium, hydropower, or the sale of agricultural land, is often framed as something that is specific to this neoliberal or post-socialist, if you will, moment that we are living in. But looking at how land was understood and used historically brings to fore projects with similar dynamics in the socialist past, and I think even pre-socialist past. Mining in Bosnia or hydropower in Croatia have much longer and more complex socialist and pre-socialist, often imperial histories. And I think work on this topic generally and in my own work has only begun, and there will be a rewriting of history as well that will help us understand today's processes better.
In your project, you employ a very multifaceted methodological approach. For example, this is the first time that you are working in archives and with archives, but also you recently did the first participatory mapping workshop. This is really interesting. Could you tell me a bit more about how you approach this topic in your project?
Thank you for this question, and also thank you for being my emotional and practical support in my archival adventures, which is always a big deal, I think. So I think researching ways in which objects take on meaning and the structures that underwrite these meanings is always difficult. I mean, yes, you can ask people, what does land mean to you? But even the question itself operates within established meanings of land. And my goal in the project is to challenge these established meanings. A well-known way of getting at those meanings is, of course, ethnographic fieldwork, spending enough time in the field to see this concept in action rather than approaching them through abstractions. And I've used ethnographic methods in my previous research, but this time I also added archival work and participatory mapping, both for practical reasons of having a different life and not being able to be in fieldwork for a year, but also because I wanted to get at different aspects of land. Now, archival work is very useful because it shows how the meanings of land changed, and this highlights the contingency of these meanings. I'm writing a paper now on the creation of a hydropower accumulation lake in Croatia and the land that was flooded to create it. And the archives here are fascinating because they allow insight into the logics that planners used to decide which land should be sacrificed and how people who were expropriated should be compensated for this land. So there are many kind of contesting meanings of land at the same time. But because the archives have a bit less of ordinary people in rural areas that I'm interested in, I also started experimenting with participatory mapping. And this means basically creating maps collaboratively with research participants. This is a method that is usually used for participatory planning. And usually in planning, these maps then become important data. In my own research thus far, I use the workshops more as an entry point into a discussion of what matters for people in a particular location. In other words, which meanings they give to the terrain that we are working on the map. And this is something that I'm very, very excited to keep working on and develop in the future because so far it has shown quite productive.
What about rural areas and their importance in your project, in the sense of both rural fieldwork, of course, that you also mentioned, but also your focus on the marginalized actors?
I think a lot of discussion about Yugoslav socialism and the wars that ended it offers glimpses of rurality and rural areas. I think it's not difficult to agree that there exists a substantial amount of ruralophobia in the region. Rural areas are supposedly difficult, and the people living there are supposedly difficult. And I think rural people have been blamed for everything from starting the war to quote-unquote contaminating urban spaces like Belgrade or Split. And this is whether they came in as refugees in the 1990s or whether they came in the kind of modernization, industrialization project of Yugoslav socialism. And again, the current multiple crises that we are living make rural areas central to political discussions. Green energy, food, biodiversity, all these things are in rural areas, and this is where futures are both imagined and contested. At the same time, a lot of rural areas are going through serious depopulation, I think in all post-socialist spaces, not just Yugoslav post-socialist spaces. And this is changing both social and ecological makeups of many regions. The example that I would like to share is from Dalmatia, or the hinterland of Dalmatia in Croatia, where the lack of people means the lack of grazing animals, and the lack of grazing dramatically changes grassland habitats. So the growth of shrub and forest that happens when grasslands are not grazed fuels summer wildfires, for example, that are increasingly dangerous every year. And this is maybe a very small and specific example, but I think it shows the kinds of webs of relations that are important and that I'm interested in when I talk about land and land use. So for a kind of concluding thought, I see rural areas as both underappreciated and under-researched, and rural populations as very important actors in whatever solutions we come up for the many crises that we live in.
Thank you, Katarina, for giving us the insight into your work and taking the time to talk to me today. This brings us to the end of our today's conversation on land in Southeast Europe and land as something more than object of policy. This was the transformative podcast of the Research Center for the History of Transformations with Katarina Kušić and Jelena Đureinović.
Thank you very much for having me, Jelena.